Okay, so video games have changed the distribution of video games and the way we purchase video games. Is that a good thing or is it harming us? Let's talk about this for a second. Now, I'm here setting up for tonight's live stream, and while I do this, I like to sit and chat with all of you. This is another episode of Tofer Talks, brought to you by Mario's Backside. There we go. So let's talk about this. There have been a few things that I've seen online recently that have sparked this conversation in my head. I'm 44 years old. I grew up in the 80s. Buying video games were very different back then. When I wanted a copy of Roger Rabbit, let's say, for the Game Boy, I would have to find somebody to drive me to the store, or if I were old enough, I'd drive myself to the store, and I would have to buy a copy of Roger Rabbit. But I would get this awesome, beautiful little cartridge to go with it. In modern times, 2024, when we want a video game, we have a few options. Some game developers and publishers decide to still put out physical products, which I think is very cool. And there are some developers that decide to do download only, which I also think is cool. I don't have a problem downloading my media. If the choice is left to me, I always physically buy it, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out here. So I saw a video recently, and I'm not going to name any names, but it was somebody probably closer to my age that was, let's say, lamenting about the fact that they had to wait to download the DLC for Elden Ring. Okay? Not only did they have to wait, potentially an hour, a couple hours, depending on how fast your download speeds are, but once it was downloaded, they had to then wait for an update. So the DLC that was just downloaded then had to patch itself on probably some kind of day one patch. And this person goes on to talk about how they have waited at least 3 or 4 hours to just play the game. And they happen to mention that back in the day, you would just go to the store and you would buy a disc or a cartridge, you would bring it home and you would pop it in your console, boom, it was ready to play. No day one updates. That means a company couldn't ship their game broken, right? Absolutely not. If you grew up in the same era I did, you know damn well we used to buy games that were broke as shit. But you know what those games were called? They were just called bad games. Now, I understand the sentiment. A game gets released, you just want to pop it in your console and play the game. You don't want to have to wait for anything. But let's look back at the process that we had to go through before in order to get a game we wanted to play. We had to drive to a store, or we had to find somebody to drive us to a store if we weren't old enough to drive yet. Oh, but actually, we had to wait until that store opened on release day. So let's say the game came out on a Tuesday, right? We would have to go to work or go to school, or if you were lucky, it was maybe you were off for the day. And then you have to wait for the store to open, which is usually about 10 o'clock. This is a physical release, so mind you, most stores weren't getting the game until their FedEx or UPS shipment came that day, which sometimes could be 10 o'clock, sometimes it could be noon. So let's say, best case scenario, you drove yourself, you already had your driver's license, and you were off of work or school that day. You get to the game store or Target or Toys R Us or wherever you're buying, at 10 o'clock when they open. Aha! You weren't the first person to think of this, right? There was usually a line that you had to wait in. If it was a big release, like a Super Mario 3, or even something like Grand Theft Auto Vice City or San Andreas, you had to wait in this line. I waited in line for probably 3 hours when I was living in Burbank at the time for Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. 3 hours in line. Now, mind you, this was something that I actually enjoyed doing, and if there were still launches like this, I probably would still take part. But you would get to the store, you'd wait in line, and then you'd buy your physical copy of the game, right? You drive all the way back home, you get home, and guess what you don't have to do? You don't have to update your game or your console or anything. You just pop the game in and play. And at this point, it might be 1 o'clock in the afternoon before you get to do that. You're following, right? So you get home and you pop the game in. We didn't really have the internet, and we certainly didn't have social media like this to watch all kinds of previews and maybe even look at early reviews, right? We were just going based off of something we saw in Nintendo Power or EGM or GamePro or whatever we saw it in. It is at this point that we find out not only if this is a good game or not, we find out if we even like the game. Up until this point, it's all a gamble. When I was a kid, this was the gamble we took on movies. This was the gamble we took on music, and it was the gamble we took on games. We had to rely on print ads that we would look at and go, that picture looks cool, that might be a game that I want to play. We have far more options at our disposal nowadays to help us decide if a piece of media is something we might even be interested in, right? It would help if I plugged the right HDMI in. There we go. Nowadays, we don't have to leave our homes if we don't want to buy a game. In fact, we could most of the time preload the game days before it's ever released. And then right at midnight, or if you're on the West Coast like me, sometimes at 9 o'clock, you have access to playing this game. But wait. There's the day one patch. Almost everything has a day one patch, right? And the complaint that I see a lot is this allows developers to release a broken game, which I see that perspective, and I do think that there is some truth in that. But what if that also allows a developer to potentially make what would have been a bad or broken game better, or to even fix the game? Let's take a look at something like a No Man's Sky. It's a really good example, or Fallout 76, right? Both of these games really sort of need an internet connection to work, so it's kind of a bad facsimile, but let's use them as an example anyways. If back in, say, like the late 90s, No Man's Sky would have been released in the state that it was released in, that would have just been considered a bad game, and it would have crashed and burned, and the developer potentially would have shut down. And let me tell you, from somebody who's been playing games his whole life, there have been plenty of stinkers. Now with modern gaming, the developer actually has the ability to fix a broken game, to update it. And I get it, there's a flip side to that coin. It also gives developers the option to push something out and ship it and just say, fuck it, we'll fix it after it's out. But my point actually is, has gaming really changed for the worse? Or, as we age, are we just failing to adapt? Game ownership and digital rights and all of that aside, which is a whole separate argument in my opinion, I think that the delivery and accessibility of new games is actually, I'm going to catch a bunch of shit for this, but far better than it was when we were kids. Yes, we used to be able to go down to the store and buy the game. We could buy the cartridge, we could buy the disc, we could come straight home and put it in our system. But that doesn't mean there wasn't bad games. We had plenty of broken, bad games. The video game industry almost crashed and burned for good because of this. E.T., I'm looking at you. I look at something like Fallout 76 as a modern day E.T. This thing released, it wasn't what people wanted. But over the course of a year, 2 years, the developer has been able to go back in and add stuff to it and fix it, and I hear that it's a fine game nowadays. Now, this is just me talking, and I'm very aware that there are lots of counterpoints and counter arguments that can be made for situations like this. And like I said, digital ownership and rights are a completely separate argument. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm merely saying that the next time we have to sit and wait for an update on the couch in our underwear and we complain about it, maybe we should just think back to the time when we used to have to work around retail hours, drive all the way to a store, buy a game, bring it back home, and hope that it was a good game. Because if it wasn't, there was no updates and there was no fixing it. It was just a bad game. But anyway, hit the comments and let me know what you think. Is Gen X and millennials just getting old and not adapting? I don't want to be that old, grumpy person. I love technology. Alexa, turn on the arcade.